Okay, then. Well, it is episode number 46 of Space Rocks Uplink, and absolutely thrilled to be back. It is an exciting evening. And, well, if it's all systems go, then we should be seeing Mark McCorcoran. How are you doing? Lovely to see you again.
Good, Alex. Good. Just need to adjust my volume here, but you go ahead, and I'll just faff around
Very
while
good.
everybody is.
It's always a good idea to have a good faff before Space Rocks Uplink begins, I suppose assuming that where all systems go,
Yeah, all good.
I suppose it makes sense for us before we actually begin with this episode of Space Rocks Uplink. We should probably acknowledge someone who is sadly no longer with us. For whom the image behind you wouldn't exist. Michael Collins of Apollo 11.
Yeah, so this is, of course, Michael Collins was the pilot on the command module on Apollo 11 in 1969, July 1969, and he stayed on the command module while Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin went down to the surface. And in some sense, the loneliest man alive at that point. This is actually a picture from Apollo 8, the original sort of Earthrise picture that was remastered more recently by adding some color images to make the original black and white picture showing it just above the horizon. There's a beautiful picture taken during Apollo 11 by Michael as his colleagues come back from the surface of the moon in the lunar module, and he takes a picture of them and the Earth in the background. And really, not metaphorically, everybody in the universe that we know of, all human beings, except Michael Collins, are in that picture because Buzz and Neil are in the lunar module, and everybody on the Earth in 1969 is in the background. So very sad news that he died this week, and he joined social media relatively recently and a couple of years ago, and was absolutely fascinating to see his perspective on the way he saw space today compared to how it was in 1969. And everybody's had amazingly positive things to say about him as a human being, which is very gratifying to see.
Indeed, I think it was his account. Was it Carrying the Fire? Just this wonderful, articulate, and important views. Reminding us perhaps it's not always just like the science, but it's also the human perspective that comes back. And I suppose that's what tonight's episode is all about: is ensuring that all perspectives are allowed to be shared across this great human endeavor. So tell us a little bit about our guest tonight. We have Jacqueline Campbell and Gaitee Hussain joining us.
Indeed. So Jacqueline is at the University of Oxford in Earth Sciences, and she's currently studying ocean acidification. So how the composition of the ocean is changing as CO2 rises around the world. That can lead to acidification of our oceans. So that's a really important indicator to do with climate change. And she's just finished a PhD last year at University College London on Mars geology. So she's a space scientist and an Earth scientist all wrapped up in one. And I think that's something that's very important for what we're talking about today. It's not, as we've said many times on Space Rocks, not only about looking outwards, but it's about reflecting on us, on the planet that we live in. And she has a very interesting story to tell, and I'm not going to preempt it at all by going through that now, about how she came to be in the position that she is, the jobs that she's got now. And I think when she tells the story, I think it'll be when I first heard it a couple of years ago, it was a really important marker for me to step back and think about how do we engage with people who might otherwise have not had access to the jobs that some of us sort of have taken for granted. I went to university, did a PhD, undergraduate degree PhD in astrophysics, and have been an astronomer ever since. But that's not always the case for many people. And our other guest this evening is Gaitee Hussain, who recently came to the European Space Agency to be the head of the science division in the Directorate of Science and Exploration, where I work. And that means she's responsible now for all of the project scientists and all of the missions which are studying the solar system and the wider universe and fundamental physics as well. She's an astronomer and previously was working at the European Southern Observatory, our partners, if you like, our European ground-based observing partners with the big telescopes in South America and Chile. So she was working in Germany at the headquarters and has a long career in astrophysics, having worked in the US and the UK. She has a story to tell as well about how she came to be where she is. So they're both strong advocates for the topic this evening, for diversity, inclusion, representation, and accessibility. And it's something I think that we've talked about, but we need to hear more voices on that because it's a critically important topic to space rocks and what we do in space.
Indeed, critically important, and I think testament to the sort of platform that we hope Space Rocks will be, because we do want to invite every perspective to join us at the table. Jacqueline, how are you doing? Are you receiving?
Yeah, I can hear you loud and clear.
I'm completely disappointed, Jacqueline. Come on, there's at least a 15-minute delay if you're going to be on Mars.
That's true. That's true. It's just a backdrop. It's better than the cupboards behind me that you would be able to see.
Indeed. And Gaitee, I believe you're receiving. Are you all connected okay?
I hope so.
Oh, fantastic.
Good to see everyone.
Fantastic. Well, welcome both. What a pleasure it is to have you here. And as I was just remarking with Mark, an important episode for so many reasons, to share these experiences, to share perspectives, and to invite all voices, to this forum. And I suppose it's interesting, of course, because the title that we settled on, for this particular episode, is a riff, on an expression I think anyone familiar with the space race will know. For all mankind. We called it For All Humankind. In the spirit of inclusion and diversity and so on. So I wanted to start with you, Gaitee. Over the course of your career, how much have you seen things change? And perhaps even more importantly, how much have they yet to change, and how much more do they need to change?
So I think things have definitely changed for the better. Certainly in the 20 years or so since I did my PhD. I would say when I started out, I am very fond of telling the story just because I've only shamefully recently realized how horrific it was. But when I was a PhD student, the first astronomy meeting I went to in my area, I was taken aside by senior women in the area and just told which people to avoid of the male persuasion in the meeting. And that was normal. It was the whisper network. That's how women protected themselves. And then more recently, when I was at ESO and stories started hitting the media about unacceptable behavior in various universities and other places as well, I realized that we hadn't substantially re-examined in enough places how we deal with these things. And society was moving on. And in fact, the tech world has systems in place. And it was time for astronomy to get on board with that, basically. So, but then the other thing was I came in with a whole bunch of ideas. Okay, this is how I would like to have seen things being when I was there. But I found you really had to talk to people who are early career scientists now to find out what they really wanted, to feel safe, to feel heard, to feel that if something happened that they felt uncomfortable with, that they knew who they could talk to, and that they knew that things were unacceptable and that we needed to push back on them. And so things move on, right? Culture moves on. One thing that I think has really helped is social media. It hasn't helped many things, but I think it has helped that because we can share knowledge. We can share knowledge of things that have worked in conferences and things that haven't, in order to make people feel like they will be heard and make them heard. And also, it's a very effective way of warning people that things have changed and culture has changed and moved on, and that people just aren't going to put up with things anymore. And I think that's a really positive thing. So there are downsides, and you can talk about that, but I do think it's helped. It's helped conversations happen much faster than we would have been able to have them otherwise. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's really helping. And I think we're also, through social media as well, managing to share more stories of how science is really done. Otherwise, the narrative's kind of taken away from us, and it's repackaged and represented in media stories and on TV and movies. And it's not necessarily the way science works. And people are allowed to share the way that they do science, and it's in many different ways, and we get to hear people's stories and people's experiences that much more. Again, much thanks to social media, I would say, more than anything else. So I think that's changed things a lot, but we do have a long way to go.
Right.
We still have very uneven coverage for people, especially women who want to have families. It's really uneven, really uneven, shockingly uneven, frankly. When I was a postdoc in the US, a friend of mine was pregnant, and she had to use her sick leave to cover her maternity leave. There was no maternity leave provision in the NSF fellowships at the time. And to be honest, things haven't changed enough, frankly, on that front. And I think we have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of money that we need to be investing in workplaces now. So I think we've moved on culture-wise, but we need to move on with putting the money where our mouth is, basically.
Right. So Jacqueline, let me bring you in here, because I'm not saying it's a different perspective, but it's maybe a slightly expanded perspective, because you had a life outside of academia beforehand. And I sort of trailed that by saying, when I first met you a couple of years ago and heard that story, it caused me to think about how we increase accessibility. So I'd love you to tell that story for our audience, because I didn't do it. And then, maybe give us a perspective on how it's looked moving from one world into another, because that obviously brings things into relief as well.
Yeah, so I had a bit of an unconventional path into science. I grew up in Edmonton in North London, which is like quite an impoverished area. I went to Howard School, which had some great science teachers, but at that time I didn't do science. I didn't think science was for me. I was told, science is really hard. And so I did some A-levels in like English literature, history and media studies, and I failed them all. And I just worked in a shop in Wood Green High Street, and then I saw an advert in the job centre, which my friend had been going to apply to London Underground and work as a station assistant there. So I went and worked on London Underground as a station assistant for just under a year. And then I saw an advert internally for train driver to drive the tube. So I applied for that, got that. And then I was a train operator on London Underground on the Northern and District lines for over 10 years. During that time, I'd always been interested in science. And whenever it was my birthday or Christmas, my friends would always get me these sort of like nice coffee table books of beautiful planetary images. And there was actually a really nice guy on the District line called Nick Shimonik, who does astrophotography in his back garden. You might have seen him about. He sometimes has been on the TV before. Yep. He's got a little observatory in his back garden. What the seat to use the telescope is a train chair from the tubes that was going spare. And he was so supportive and so encouraging. It was just like, you really know a lot about this. You should look into it more seriously. Lent me books and stuff. And I started doing some correspondence courses with the Open University and sort of really basic science, like introductory science short courses. I didn't do very well. I don't think I passed a single one of them. And I just didn't really know how to study science. I didn't know what my end goal was. I just knew that I liked it. And I knew that I was terrible at maths. So I just thought, well, you can't become an astronomer if you're terrible at maths. And then as time went on, I kept sort of trying things. And then I did an evening course at University College London in astronomy and astrophysics. And again, there were some really nice people there who were like, you should go for this. You should keep trying. And it was really a lot of kindness from people that thought, no, I will keep trying. And there's a really nice guy, Ian Crawford at Birkbeck. And he was like, why don't you do the degree course there? So I started a degree course in astronomy and planetary science. And then I dropped out of that because I was doing really badly. And at that time I'd quit the tube, and I didn't want to work there anymore. Wasn't happy going into work there. And so I was working 2 jobs as a retail worker in a running shoe store, and also as a care worker for a charity that supports autistic people. And so I was doing those 2 jobs and then going to Birkbeck in the evenings, and I didn't do very well. And then I moved down to Brighton for another care job with Autism Sussex, doing similar support work. And a guy who worked there had been looking at applying to University of Brighton and said, why don't you, you're really interested in space and stuff. And I had a look. They didn't do any space courses there, but they did have a course in earth and ocean science and geology courses. And I thought, I'm not very good at maths. And it seems to me the stuff I enjoyed most when I had done my other studies was the stuff about planets and rocks and, you know, history of water on Mars and finding life on other planets, evolution, all that sort of stuff. And I'd missed clearing even. It was really late. It was like September. And then I just chanced emailing someone. And a lot of the stuff I've done has come from just like trying to elbow my way in and chance it with people. And I emailed the course leader, Norman Moles at University of Brighton, who was just like, why don't you come in for a chat? And I found it actually benefited me that I was more of a mature student who had other experiences and had sort of tried and failed at things and was willing to give things a chance. And he was willing to take a chance on me and said, you know, just come and start the course on Monday and we can sort out like the student finance and stuff later. And so I came in and I started the course, and I was doing that full time and then working part time still at Autism Sussex. And I just did great. And with this like full-time course surrounded by these people who were really interested in the subject and people that were willing to sit and show me. And I also found that as one of the older students, I was a bit less worried about going, I don't understand that. Like, can you just say that whole thing again? And everyone's like, oh, we want to go home. And so that was great. And again, carrying on elbowing my way indoors, I had been on a field trip thing, like to visit Mullard Space Science Laboratory when I had done the UCL evening course. So all of these things I'd done that I'd sort of like tried and failed, they actually did come in handy later, because I would never have even known about Mullard Space Science Laboratory if I had not tried and failed that UCL course. And so I just kept emailing them and bugging them. And then eventually I kind of elbowed my way in by like going to see public talks and stuff. And someone was like, I know someone that works there. Why don't you come along? And so I got to do my final year undergrad project at Mullard Space Science Laboratory, looking for organic signatures on Mars. And then that led to me being able to do a PhD there on the same subject. And it sort of took off from there. And a lot of it was luck and being in the right place at the right time. But a huge amount of it was people being kind to me, despite the fact that I had this complete long history of failures, and me always willing to sort of get back up again and elbow my way in the door. And so that's how I'm here now.
So let me pick up on that before we go on. You've got particularly sharp elbows by the sound of it. And I don't think that's a bad thing, but not everybody has that. And a lot of people would have been knocked back earlier, right? I mean, your persistence is astonishing. So in that regard, it's clear that it takes that kind of persistence. But should it? I mean, how do we create an opportunity where it doesn't require that people who are engaged and interested and talented and are willing to you've got to put some work in. I mean, it's not going to fall at your feet either, right? I mean, it shouldn't. So what is the lesson that you can take from your particular persistence and spread it out more generally?
Yeah, I completely agree. You shouldn't have to be. You should have to just be adequate, right? Like plenty of people seem to have got far enough in life just being satisfactory. And, you know, you shouldn't have to have these super sharp elbows. And going back to something that Gaitee was saying about the changing culture, and there has been a lot of stuff with kind of like, oh, you know, we want more diverse workforce. We want people from different backgrounds come in. But in order to stay in and not fall out of that pipeline, they need to have thick skin and sharp elbows. And they shouldn't have to, particularly when they've been sold a bit of a lemon that, you know, you're welcome here, come and join us. And then they get there and it's horrible and it doesn't need to be. So I think what I would like to do with my persistence is use that to make it so that other people don't have to be so persistent. And a huge amount of the persistence was me like forging networks of people and like smooth talking people. And some people are not very good with people and they don't make a great impression, and, you know, they find it hard to make friends, and they shouldn't have to do that to sort of make their own sort of little nepotism bubble where people will go, oh, here's this chance for you. Obviously, a lot of people will have that in their friends and family circle. Other people like me create that circle, but you shouldn't have to. You should have the opportunity to do things regardless of who you know.
Mm.
Well, I mean, this is it's an absolutely fascinating trajectory, and I think, you know, looping back in with what we talked about initially with Gaitee as well. I mean, I suppose this is a question that, you know, pervades almost every area of study, of, you know, be it media, you know, creativity, academics, whatever else. The question that is persistent and I think common, the answers aren't always the same. Gaitee, I wondered what your thoughts are. Is it something that is endemic to the area of space exploration, or is it simply representative of a wider cross-section of society? Are these problems simply emblematic of a wider societal problem, or is there something specific to this field, do you think?
So I think the answer is yes to both things. I think we have societal problems. We're not going to fix all the societal problems. I think there are specific things within academia generally and astronomy and space science specifically that we can address. And one of the things is, there was actually a really interesting discussion a couple of days ago in the ESO Cosmic Duologues, where they were talking about how we measure scientific performance. And our tendency, even now, is to use metrics that are based on how many publications you have. And they're very much based on how much your publication statistics are growing. It's kind of a very capitalistic point of view, basically, of looking at what scientific productivity is valued. And at the same time, we talk all the time, because we're often living on public funding, ESA certainly is, we talk about inclusivity and diversity and the values. And like Jacqueline said, we are kind of trying to sell people a lemon, because we're not really living those ideals. And often our metrics are maybe not completely antagonistic, but there's some contradictions within our metrics and what we say our value system is. And so that is being addressed a lot more. There are whole systems in the Netherlands. There's a lot of discussion about how we what kind of a workplace are we trying to create in academia, in science specifically, and the different kinds of career profiles that you would want to invite in, and what your metrics are for each of those different scientific profiles. So some of those might be people who are really good at doing open science and really, propagating data and things like that. But then you also can have space for the lone wolf scientist that lives in people's imaginations as well. So there can be room for multiple different profiles, but we really have to do it intentionally. And I think we haven't been across the board. And so I think there are specific things we can do. But it is true, we inherit societal ills, and we have to acknowledge that as well, and do whatever we can to mitigate those. One of the things I realized only after I lived in the US, because suddenly things became a lot more difficult for me, not being European and not having a British passport. When I came back, is when I have students who have passports from outside of the European Union, there is a lot of extra work that they have to do just to make it to conferences, just to be in the country. If their PhD overruns, they risk losing their visa. This is mental labor that you're requiring them to do, but still perform, right? And there's a million examples like that from people of all kinds of different backgrounds. And we have to reduce that amount of labor we're just expecting people to just absorb. And that's something we can do. Sure, this exists in society, but I think we're intelligent enough that we can make space and try to address many of those issues. We won't solve them, but we can certainly acknowledge them. And I think that's a good start, and try to mitigate where we can.
I just wanted to come back to this idea of the metrification. I don't mean it in the sense of changing from pounds, shillings, or pence, but to having metrics and measuring things. Because in a weird way, actually, I think when I started my career, which is further back in the past, I started as a PhD student in 1982, those things didn't actually count so much, it seemed. There were lots and lots of biases. I mean, if you think about the people that I was doing my PhD with in the community in Edinburgh, I think it was one female PhD student at that point out of a cadre of, tens. So there were all sorts of biases there. But that measuring things and making people jump through numerical quantitative hoops wasn't such a big part of the picture, and it's become prevalent. We see it in the UK with the REF and all of these things of how you measure the performance of universities. And it's interesting. I'm not saying that it was more open without those metrics, but you've put the metrics in because it's kind of easier to measure now. You've got computers and you can just add things up and you rank people. So I just wonder whether we just get rid of metrics completely, or we just have to de-bias them. I'm not sure. I mean, clearly we have to de-bias them, that's obvious, but can we get rid of them completely? Or, do we just... I'm not even sure I know what the question is, but I was just sort of struck that 35 years ago, metrics just weren't used at all. Maybe it was just a nudge and a wink, and he's a good chap, and don't worry, he'll do you well, without actually assessing whether they're any good at all. It was just on a nod.
Which works very well if you're in the old boys network, right?
Yeah, sure.
So it had its downside as well. But I mean, I do think metrics can serve a function. I think the danger is when we think we're being objective with those metrics, because we just aren't. And I think we need to be very honest with that. And we need to be very honest that those metrics don't give us what we want necessarily at the end of the day. So I think they can be used as part of a whole, but we have to really be careful about how we define the whole. And that requires work, right? So that's why it hasn't been done in quite the joined up way that maybe it should be done. Yeah. So I think that's what we need to work on. But I'm not against metrics in themselves. I think they tell you something. But how you use them, I think, is the trick, right? And also, maybe you can hire somebody who has amazing metrics, but you might want to balance that by hiring other people. Particularly, we hire a lot of research fellows every year. We might actually want balanced profiles in total and not look for balance in one person. So I think expecting everybody to hit all your criteria is a bit unrealistic as well, especially.
Yeah. I mean, if you started with the H index, which for people who don't know is this sort of crazy thing, which is you work out the number at which you've had as many papers with the same number of citations or more. I mean, so it's some kind of metric of how often people are reading the papers that you write. But as you say, I mean, that's very field dependent. It's very it's a number which serves a certain kind of scientist, perhaps. It's not a bad number in that regard, but it misses out on all sorts of people that serve enormously important roles because, you know, as you said earlier on, I think one of you said, you know, the lone wolf approach to science. Actually, 95% of what we do these days isn't that way at all. It's teamwork, and that's probably not really measured very well in the H index or any of these other, you know, just how many papers have you published. And then particle physics has been there a little bit before us because it's had these enormous collaborations of thousands of people, and it's had to come up with different ways of assessing the role that people play. I mean, have you looked into that at all? There's any, you know, as astronomy becomes bigger and bigger teams, it's nothing new, but it's an increasing part of what we do. What sorts of ways do you think we might be able to use as alternatives to simply a number? You know, there's my H number.
It's a good question. I mean, I'm not sure I have the definitive answer for that. I think we work very closely with extremely large consortia, ever increasing consortia, as you know, for many of our space missions. And I think we need to be working closely with them to also make sure that we're having conversations with them about how they're using the early career scientists in their consortia, and make sure that they walk away with skills that will serve them well in future careers. Because the danger is that they will do a very, of course, a necessary but small part of the puzzle, and they won't have the metrics, or it won't be obvious how the metrics that they have can translate into their effort. So something that there's a big conversation about is that you start saying in papers exactly what your contribution to that paper was. And I think that would be one way to start addressing these things. But we have to make sure people get credit for their work. Otherwise, we go back into a previous time when, for instance, people were called computers and they weren't actually recognized.
Women mostly, right? In that case.
Mostly women. Yeah. And I mean, to be honest, my mother is a microbiologist, she's an immunologist. And she has done a lot of free labor for labs all over the world because she started PhDs. My dad would get transferred. And the science world is extremely happy to take on free labor from people, right? Extremely happy, but the credit is missing. And so I think we need to start addressing that and need to start saying, okay, how could we acknowledge what your contributions are to things? And that's something we really need. And you're right, the particle physics world has done that already. So I think there's a lot of learning we can apply there. But to be honest, I haven't looked into exactly how. And I think that's an avenue to explore. It's very.
So before I bring Jacqueline back in, Alex probably has a question too. So there's an anecdote which you reminded me of there from a few years ago. I'm not going to name any names, but I joined ESA in 2009, which was the year that the Herschel and Planck observatories were launched on a single Ariane 5. And about a year later, there was a big science meeting at ESTEC where you and I, nominally work whenever we go there. It hasn't been that often. And it was for the Herschel mission, and there were around 400 people in the room, crowded into the big conference room. And a very senior astronomer, who I won't name, I've known them for a long time, and sort of they've been involved in that mission for a very long time. And I sort of went over to the person and said, so, you must be happy. Here we are. Finally, it's launched, and the science is being done, and it's all going. And they turned to me and said, Mark, there are too many people in this room. And I didn't really know what to make of that to begin with, but rapidly realized as we talked that what they meant was that it's just become a huge industry of postdocs and students being used to process data and not being given the credit, but the PIs at the top end are going to be the ones that get the prizes and everything else. And more's the point, we take a lot of those people in and then we burn them up, and we can't guarantee that they're going to have jobs at all. And that, was very different in my time. And I look back at it and I think I just probably wouldn't have survived if it had been the way it is today. Anyway, let's switch topics briefly. Jacqueline, one thing I wanted to get to you about is because, of course, a lot of this starts very young as well. We're talking about people already in the game, already in the system. But the point you made about being told when you're very young that this wasn't for you, right? You could not do this. It seems to me that we also need to address that end of it as well, in order to not to get fewer people into science, but get more people in and then give them jobs as well. So I'm interested on your views on that. How do you reflect on your experience and say, well, how do I go back to the 5-year-olds, the 10-year-olds, the 15-year-olds and say, actually, you can. This is available to you.
Yeah, I think a huge amount of it is to do with role models, because, if you come from a family where your mum's a doctor and your dad's a doctor and your uncle is the editor of a journal and your next door neighbor, because you live on a nice street, works at the university, then that that's for you, right? And if a person who grew up like that ended up becoming the manager of a supermarket, they would be considered a failure. And which is terrible, because it's great to be a manager of a supermarket. I think the pandemic has shown us how hopefully people will realize how important these kind of retail jobs are, and lots of other frontline work. And so you see it all the time. You see families everybody's a nurse in the family, or there's these kind of threads. And so if you don't have anyone like that around you growing up, it doesn't seem like it's a possible job. And I think that we might have spoken about this before. A lot of the stuff around space, they often use astronauts as kind of this example of oh, look, here's this cool astronaut, which is amazing. But what are the odds of you actually becoming an astronaut, right? And their whole spiel around it is look how amazing this person is. They beat all these other candidates to become this one special person that got to go to the moon or the ISS. But that's probably not going to be your career if you're growing up in Edmonton. So I think it's important to have role models that look like people, sound like people they're addressing, so that they can go, oh, that I can do that. And also, a huge amount of it, going back to what Gaitee was saying about how social media has helped scientists explain how they do science. I think that a lot of scientists they like this idea that what they do is really difficult and really special. And perhaps at school, they weren't the most popular person. They were a little bit nerdy. And so they like that it's I'm really smart and I'm really clever and you could never do this. And so we've got to kind of remove that from science and be actually, there's lots of different avenues you can go down, particularly with space science. There's all sorts of different backgrounds that people come from academically that can work in these fields. And not all of them rely on a huge understanding of maths and physics. There's all sorts of different fields, and it's inherently interdisciplinary. So if we can show people that it's not just physics and maths, there's this huge wide range of things you can do. Here are people that are from your area that look like you and sound like you that do this. And more importantly, this is the path that you can follow, because I didn't even know really what a PhD was. I knew some people had them, but I had no clue that I could do one. And when I started my PhD, I had no idea what I was actually doing. I just kind of had gotten it. And then it took sort of as I was going along to understand what it was and what was expected at the end. And there are all these kind of faux pas I made and stuff because I didn't really understand what was happening. So I think if we make the whole process a lot more transparent and people can talk to people about what it is they did to get there. And I've spoken to you about this before, Mark. A lot of the skills that you need to become a scientist are things that people already do in other facets of their life. Everybody is an expert in something. Everybody has a detailed knowledge of something and does really tedious stuff to make that thing perfect, whether it's their hobby or their job or just an interest or whatever. People already have those skills, and it's whether or not you can transfer them and find something else you're interested in science. So I think that's really important. And I also think it's understandably, a lot of the outreach stuff is aimed at kids because, there's this thing about it's up until age 7, really, people kind of decide what they want to do from that age. And, we've got to get to the teenagers and blah, blah, blah. But, I'm really interested in the people like me who missed that boat and were growing up in a time where there were more biases and it was harder for people of color and women to get into these things. So I don't see why they should have had to miss the boat on that, and that we can utilize those amazing skills people have from their other parts of their life that they're using and bring them into science. And then that would just massively increase the chances of anyone becoming a scientist. Because if Dave, who works in ASDA, or Shirley, the bus driver, is now a scientist, that's going to make you go, well, I can do it regardless of your age group. And you're going to trust scientists more because you know them and you used to work with them and you used to see them here and they live in your area. So I think that's the key, is diversifying science, and it will filter out and expand and encompass everybody, hopefully.
Yeah,
that's incredibly well said. And I think to remind everyone that we have people joining from all over the world, Ukraine, Netherlands, the list goes on and on. Somebody in our chat tonight, watching, makes a really important point, and it strikes a chord with something you said, Jacqueline, about role models. Pointing out the film called Hidden Figures, which of course, is an incredibly brilliant example of the need not just to acknowledge our current role models, but also to rewrite the narrative, to rewrite the history of space exploration, and also acknowledge the contributions of these incredibly important people that in many ways they've been excluded, written out, marginalized, and overlooked in the construction of this endeavor that we call space exploration. But I wanted to go back to something you said, Jacqueline, at the very start, because your experience of getting into academia is so interesting, because of course we're talking about a complex of issues, myriad biases, all kinds of forms of discrimination and so on. But how much of a problem from your perspective is the actual barrier to entry itself? I mean, the ivory tower, does it still exist in that classic sense? Has it been broken down? And how do you actually transform that? Because that doesn't only apply to, of course, scientific fields, but also the humanities as well. Just the institutional barrier that academia can sometimes represent to people.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I'm white, so I have a huge advantage in that, I can change my accent a little bit, or if I'm around people who are from Europe or the United States, then they don't really know what my accent signifies. So obviously that's much easier for me. Also, I don't have a disability. So, this is another major thing that makes people's lives a lot harder. So I can't speak to that from my personal experience, but I think there are still a lot of barriers, even if they're just, you've got no idea where to start. You've got no idea who to talk to, and you don't want to be a trouble. Like when you're already kind of seen, I think, it's interesting you talked about Hidden Figures, because I think in many ways that kind of sanitized a lot of it and sort of made the white guys look like they were actually really good guys and they really wanted to help these women, but it was the times and stuff. But the truth is that if you start making a bit of a racket and saying, oh, there's a problem here, you very quickly get a name for yourself. And that's compounded much more, I think, especially for Black women. And so if they start complaining and saying, this isn't right and this isn't right, you'll very quickly sort of have a mark next to your name that this person causes trouble. And so anytime you ask for any change to be made, or you need some sort of concession to be made to make things easier for you for whatever reason, which isn't making it any easier for you, it's just bringing you up to the level everybody else is at the first place. I think those barriers are still there massively, and a lot needs to be done. And particularly with regards to access to science, I hope that we keep a lot of the virtual stuff that's been going on as a result of the pandemic, because for years disabled activists have been asking for stuff to be put in place so that they could access things virtually, and were told it can't be done, and then it was done virtually overnight. So why not keep those things? And it doesn't just apply to disabled people, it applies to just people from other parts of the world, obviously the global south, but even for myself, I don't want to have to travel to the United States of things, particularly in view of like climate change and stuff. Why not keep a lot of these things that in some ways have made people's lives easier? And there's no reason why you can't incorporate in-person elements as well. So I think it's clear that we've managed to massively change the whole structure of things overnight that can benefit people immediately. Why not do that? And in some cases, it might even save money. It might not even cost anything to do these things. Why not listen to the people who are asking for this stuff to be done? And also value those people's time. I think that a lot of people who are marginalized in science then get kind of asked to do this additional work on top of, like you were saying, Gaitee, about your bandwidth is taken up with all this extra stuff, like the students having to deal with visas and whatnot. And then they're asked on top of that to do like equality and diversity things, which takes up more of their time, and they get invited to conferences not to talk about their science, about stars or planets or whatever, and they're just like put in the diversity thing, and that's your contribution now, which can also be like pretty traumatic for people to have to keep going over this stuff. So I think we can make these sorts of changes to stop those barriers really quite quickly and pretty much overnight.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on that. Something Alex and I have reflected on. We started Uplink a year ago on the basis that we weren't able to do our live events, and here we are a year later, and it's become an essential part of what we do. And we think, when we go back to the live events, and that will be true of many of, in academia, but in much of the world, how can you make it more accessible? And it's not about saying, oh, well, there's just going to be an audience, they'll pay more. I mean, this is all for free, right? I mean, effectively, what we do here is for people to join in. The live events somebody has to pay for the venue, so there is money involved. We try to keep it as low as possible, but we're well aware that we're not reaching the full audience. It's a bit of an insider club, a little bit. And I just wondered in that regard, Gaitee, to bring that to you, because we've talked about, Jacqueline mentioned the other diversities which are out there, but this ethnic diversity is something that ESA's pretty bad at this time, I would say. I mean, you must have seen that in the 6 months or so, even though you haven't been able to walk around the corridors as much as normal, but it's something you're surely aware of, and it's true throughout astronomy. I don't think it's peculiar to ESA in that regard. So is there something differently that we have to do for all of the different marginalized or disadvantaged groups, or is it one size fits all? And I'm not asking that in a sense because, it's not a naive question. I've struggled with it, and I don't really know the answer because I'm a white old man, and it's not my experience in quite the same way, but I'm open to trying to understand how we do it, because the gender thing in space rocks, at least we've managed, we've done quite well, and I don't mean that as kind of greenwashing. It's just, yeah, but I don't know how to do the others in quite the same way. So I'm interested to hear your views on it.
So, let's be clear. I guess none of us really have the answers. Otherwise, things would be better, right? So let's start with that. And also, I'm not a social scientist, and I think there's a lot of learning that we need to bring over from that side. However, I do have thoughts. It won't surprise you to hear. As I sort of mentioned earlier, when I moved to the US, it was massive culture shock for me, because in the UK, my accent, my background, the color of my skin, there were ways that people could interpret that. In the US, I now understand what happened is that I lost my privilege. And it was really interesting and really uncomfortable, really, really uncomfortable. There wasn't a week that a colleague didn't ask me how the hell I got in that room, right? And asked me how I got there from Pakistan. There wasn't one single week that I was in the US that didn't happen. Now, for context, my last name is Hussain. This was after 9/11. It was a heightened, horrible time for everybody. So there was a context to it, but it was very eye-opening to me, because suddenly it was like, okay, so now I understand a few things, right? I understand how people see me. And what the biggest issue that I found, and it wasn't just me who had this, it was also a peer of mine. So I was at the Harvard Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics, and she was Mexican. And we had very similar experiences coming through immigration, with the conversations we were having. So when we gave talks afterwards, people would be super nice to us. Nobody would say anything bad. But the conversation would be about, how are you in this room? Why is your accent the way it is? Why do you look the way you do? Why is your name what it is? Rather than about the content of my talk. And for a long time, a shamefully long time, because I didn't have the same level of mentoring, I guess, that I would have liked in retrospect, I thought I was just giving really, really awful talks, right? I thought that was the only thing that anybody wanted to talk to me about. I mean, genuinely. And okay, my talks probably weren't great. It was early on in my career, but I do think that there was a bit more going on there. And so when I realized this was happening, and it was only really by talking to other people who are having similar experiences, that you can start to mitigate that. And I think we need to shorten the time frame for people to realize what's happening and help them get what they need. So I think we need to understand what mentoring looks like. So that's one thing, but that's for people who are already in the door, right? I mean, what we've been talking about also is, how do we reach the people that aren't in the door? I did my undergraduate degree at UCL, right? Heart of London in the 90s. there were quite a few people from Indian subcontinent origin like me there. There wasn't a single Black person, right? Not one single Black person in a class of 100 and something in UCL. And I find that unforgivable, really. I mean, that there's no reason why that should be happening unless we're doing something wrong. And so I think we need to be thinking about how we do that. And I think there's lessons to be learned from the US there, where you can go and so what they've done in many universities is strong astronomy departments have paired up with historically Black universities, and they get people to come in and do internships or do projects with them. So they get experience of doing research, they find out if they like it, and then they get contacts, right? They get contacts, and we know name recognition counts and who you know counts. And that is actually working, at least to some extent in the US. And I think I haven't seen it being done in Europe, frankly, not effectively, at least. I may be wrong. I would love to be wrong. Please correct me in the chat if I'm wrong, because I would love to talk to you if somebody's doing this well. But I actually think it's something we could do. I think it's something we could do even in the European Space Agency, right? With our internships. I really think we could target specific schools in our member states and say, look, why don't you send us people you think might be interested, or even do distance projects as we are in this day and age. And get people some experience. And I think that is really important, to give people the idea that, this might be for me, this might be something I would like to do. Something I really loved was, I just found out the Institute of Physics in their Girl Guides network, they've created a badge for I am a physicist. So if you do a number of experiments, the girls of all kinds of ages basically can get an I am a physicist badge. And I think that also is good, right? You learn to label yourself as something that maybe society tells you you might not be. And I think there's many different things we need to try, but we need to get moving. I'm really passionate about this.
Well, again, anecdotally, I'm kind of shocked a little bit about your story about London, because it is, of all of the places in the UK, at least, the most diverse in all sorts of ways. And I remember, the rest of the country isn't in quite the same way. It's different in different places, of course. But as you know, I was at the University of Exeter before I came to ESA, and we had colloquium visitors come by, and we would often go out to a local restaurant and with the colloquium speaker. And we had somebody come in from London, gave the talk, and then, because we were sitting talking, a whole bunch of undergraduates came in. Exeter's a fairly small town, lots of big university. Came in, were noisy, had their dinner and left. And then the colloquium speaker turned to us and said, "Are those your undergraduates?" And we went, yeah. He says, every single one of them was white. There was no ethnic diversity whatsoever. Now, I'm not saying anything wholly negative about Exeter as such. It's just at the far reaches, it's not next to a big city. So this idea about reaching out in a very deliberately focused ways. I mean, our intern program, you've just hired interns, I've just hired interns. At some level, you just get the list you get. I mean, if they're not in that list, if you haven't proactively gone to get people, you just pick the people from the list you have, And so I think that the ways, the mechanisms that we need to develop in order to reach out to communities. But here I wanted to bring Jacqueline back in, because what I've experienced a little bit in this regard is a real danger if you don't do it sincerely and honestly, that it looks patronizing. It's kind of white colonialism, white savior. We're parachuting into your school to give you a talk and say space is for everybody, and then we leave. It cannot just be that, right? It has to be something where it's done meaningfully but continuously as well, that you have to build a network and maintain it and feed it. Otherwise you've just come in and you've greenwashed. So Jacqueline, if you're from North London, it's a while ago now, but if you think about the school that you went to or the schools in that area, would that be well received? I mean, is it another cultural barrier? It's like, oh, it's just you people again. I don't want to be you because I don't like your world, and I don't really know how to phrase it. Even it can be seen as colonialism in its own, in a weird way, right?
I totally know what you mean. And there's some really well-meaning, lovely people I know who try to go into schools in I know Tottenham or somewhere, and I'm just like, no offense, but this is just going to put people off of wanting to become a space scientist, because they just got nothing to bond with these people in, and they're all a little bit awkward and stuff. And I'm old now, so I'm not cool anymore. I was never cool at school anyway, but you know, there is a problem there. And I think it feeds in quite nicely to some of the kind of political stuff we've been seeing about the working class this, the working class that. And, you know, they're using it as like, you know, a code word for the white working class, particularly when they're talking about northern communities. But the truth is that most Black people in London are working class. And so if you go to these areas and you're from the same class, you've got a lot more to talk about than somebody from a different class demographic, regardless of their ethnicity. And so if you go to these areas of working class people, you will get diversity. And so I think that that's really important. And I completely agree with what Gaitee was saying. It's super jarring when you go to these things and there's just not a single Black person there, despite the fact, as you say, Mark, you walk out the door and it's much more diverse. So I think we do need to do something. And yes, we can be proactive and go out to do things. But the truth is there are Black people who are trying to get in the store and they're having it shut in their face. But we can also go out and be more proactive, I think, and just go out into these areas and get, as the pipeline, people get through the pipeline, those people can go and do those things who identify more with those areas and different people. But they need to be compensated for their time, because that's time away from their research. So it's all very well me sort of going around like Tottenham and Edmonton and talking to all the kids and being like, hey, hello kids, I'm cool. Why don't you come and like do space science with me? But that's time away from me studying ocean acidification or Martian organics that other people are not doing. And I think also there's a huge number of people that are very well-meaning and maybe aren't so good, but they can do other things for you. They can support that structure in other ways and like help you make your PowerPoints for your staff, or, you know, sort out the admin and go through things and support in that way, even if they can't be on the front line. And most importantly, I think we just need to kind of change the culture around outreach so that people are compensated for their time and it's not seen as a waste of time. Because I know personally of some supervisors who actively stop their PhD students from doing any kind of outreach and you know, stop all of this kind of stuff they're doing that's going to actually increase diversity and improve science for everybody. And it's not seen as valuable and it's not compensated. So I think that would be a start.
Do you think that, just to pick up on that, is that because they see it as changing the world that they're comfortable with, or is it simply a kind of a mercantile thing saying, well, if my students aren't writing enough papers, it doesn't reflect on me, I'm a failure? Is it that, or is it that people are literally trying to build the ramparts around the ivory tower and say, I actually don't want those people in here?
Yeah, both. I mean, going back to what Gaitee was saying about the metrics and stuff, I think some of it is like we need to churn papers out and I haven't got time for you to like go to some school or like bus garage and talk to people. I think some people are very uncomfortable when like lots of Black people walk through the door and don't really want them in their universities, and they're actively stop that. But I think a pretty large number of people just don't know any better and don't know what to do. So I think that there's a lot of well-meaning people out there, and if we can get them engaged and get them in the right roles and compensate people for going out and doing this work and see it as valuable, we can do something about it. And I know there's this statistic about having just walked through a university door ever in your life like massively increases your chances of ever going to universities. So I encourage people to kind of, pandemic aside, you can do it virtually, or when things get back in person, you can do that. Open those doors, but more importantly, make it possible for people to walk through them. So at my PhD lab, we had like a work experience week, and it was always advertised very widely in the sort of southeast area. And every year you got all the local schools in Surrey coming through, and they were just predominantly white boys from a sort of middle to upper middle class demographic. And they were fantastic kids. They really wanted to be there. They loved it. And then one year, one of my PhD college colleagues, he decided to get some funding, and they put together this proposal, and a couple of students there managed to get, it's like $2 or $3 grand, and they paid for a bus from London and lunch. And from that year on, the demographic was completely different. You had 50-50 boys and girls, and you had like a mix of different ethnicities come in just because there was a bus and a lunch paid for. And obviously that doesn't account for getting people who are really struggling, who've got caring responsibilities and stuff, but it does mean that they can get there. Our lab was very remote. You needed to have a car to get there. So you've already lost a huge bunch of people there. And then having to worry about paying for your food there. It just, adding these little things that you don't need to target a certain group. You just need to provide a bus or a lunch, and you will diversify and you will get those people in. So I think that could be a start.
Yeah.
Really stimulating stuff. And biographically, I should say I went to UCL as well. So I think, when there's three of us, I think we have to give a hand sign or something. I'm sure there.
Yeah.
Anyway, but it's an interesting one because I can personally attest to, yes, absolutely. Once you cross from London across Gower Street, it becomes a very different world, and it can really be startling. And so, I want to make sure that we can bring in some voices from our chat, people joining us from all around the world, because some really stimulating thoughts and questions are coming in. There's actually one for Mark, but I'd encourage everyone to jump in. It's interesting because I was going to raise something about obviously incredibly high profile astronaut recruitment drive, which was recently launched. And what struck me was not that there was a new induction of astronauts that was taking place, but the kind of language that was being used, the parameters that were being set, and so on. And so Zujal, I apologize for mispronouncing your name, no doubt, Montano, asks, what is ESA doing to become more inclusive regarding ethnicity, diversity, and background? Can it actually do something considering the ESA convention and nationalities rules?
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, of course, within the boundaries of what ESA is, we can only recruit people from our ESA member states. And you could argue, why is that? Why couldn't you recruit from beyond? And I've actually had this discussion occasionally on social media with people where I've said, Europe, 22 countries, we're for everybody. And then somebody from Southeast Asia will chime in and say, well, you're not for me, you're excluding me. And I think that's a fair comment, right? I mean, it's a question way above our pay grades in the question of how the ESA convention could be changed. At the moment, indeed, we can only take people from our ESA member states and associated states. But I do think that's a very valid question. Flipping it around into other areas, I mean, you mentioned the astronaut campaign, the one innovation there. I mean, I think there's an implicit innovation that in the last recruitment round in 2009, we ended up with 5 men and 1 woman, and that's not going to happen again. You just know that won't happen, right? Because that's just not how the world is, and it shouldn't be that way. I mean, even think back to 2009, it shouldn't have been that way then, but there it was. There were plenty of highly qualified women pilots. Many of the air forces in Europe had already switched to having women in combat fighter jets, for example, if that was an objection. But there's loads of women scientists and all sorts, women airline pilots, all sorts of people qualified, even in 2009. The thing that's changing this time is deliberately recruiting people with disabilities to not necessarily to be in the prime astronaut corps to begin with. And the rationale for that, you would say, why not? Why not just go that way? The rationale for not doing that immediately is that the ISS and going back to the moon rely on our partners, and our partners have to accept that this is something we want to do as well. Take people that are physically challenged in certain ways. Will they be able to get out of the spacecraft if an emergency happens? There's all sorts of things that we need to consider, but we won't be able to consider that unless we bring those people in and say, look, you have this particular disability. How can you fit into the system that we have, and what do we need to change to make it possible for you in the future? And we need to negotiate with all of our space station and human spaceflight partners in order to then give them the opportunity to go. But it's something that one of my directors, Dave Parker, Human Robotic Exploration, is incredibly passionate about, and it's nothing in the line of greenwashing at all. It's something he genuinely said when I first met him, that he wanted to do this, and we will follow up on that. But it's a slow process, because it comes back also not the disability thing, but we can only recruit people that are available in the community. And that's an excuse that's often said, unless you actually go out into the community and encourage people to take up the sciences and engineering and all of the other functions we need in ESA at the early phases, then you're not doing enough to encourage a work base, because we typically only recruit people who have come out of university, have gone on and maybe done something in industry or academia. Often it's around 35 to 40. So when we say, well, that's too late, we can't change that. We can proactively be part. We're highly visible. We're funded by the taxpayer. We can't make any excuses about it being somebody else's fault. We have to play our part in working with academia, working with schools, as we've been discussing. Now, Gaitee can say, you've been at ESA for 12 years, Mark. What have you changed? And I think that I haven't changed enough. And it's maybe because my experience was that of, kind of coming through the system as one of the old guard. And in the recent years with space rocks and other things, I've become much more aware of those unconscious biases, implicit biases that I carry with me every day. And I can assure you, my 21-year-old daughter lets me know very strongly how implicitly biased I am about many things. But in that sense, I hand it to Gaitee because she's recently joined, and I know it's probably a bit of sticker shock to some extent, and saying, wow, what is this organization? It's probably true of any organization, but you know.
Yeah, so I think we're going to be doing a number of things, but I think we proactively have to go out and identify people that we think will add extra elements to our program, to our staff, that are beyond the old-fashioned metrics that we tended to hire on, and we have to move beyond those metrics. And it's certainly true, and it's true for me as much as anybody else, that from a minority background, that it helps if somebody tells you that they think you can do a job, because sometimes you just look at the jobs, and if there's literally nobody from your background doing those jobs, to be honest, this job that I applied for, to become head of the science division, I was told I'd be a good candidate, and I still sat there and thought, well, am I? I'm not really sure. Are you sure? We had the whole conversation about it, because I didn't see it, right? I just didn't see anybody who looks like me here. So I think we have to have those conversations with people and say, look, I really think you've got the skill set to do this. Why don't you put yourself forward? Let's see how far it gets, and let's see what you can add to this. So we have to do this proactively, and we have to approach hiring differently. And there's a really good opportunity coming up, in the sense that we have what we're terming a retirement wave coming up in the next years, and it's a chance to really think about what we're trying to create, especially for a lot of the space missions we're talking about now won't go up until after I retire, and so we really want to think about who do we want running this, whose voices are we missing, who isn't here, and go and find those people. And I think we need to use the networks, and we need to use people who are viewing this now, and put yourself forward and contact us if you think there's something interesting that you have to contribute to us. And I think we need to look again at how we hire, and HR are actually really open to this in experience. So the Director General, even the previous Director General, has talked a lot about diversity, and again really put effort into it, so it's not lip service. So I think there's an opportunity here, and I think we can do good things with it, but we need to do it visibly so people can see, so they have confidence in what we're doing. Otherwise, it's not worth anything.
I guess the slight danger here is that both of us work for ESA, and we might be slightly reflexively defensive. So I'm going to ask Jacqueline, who's from the outside, saying, you don't owe us anything. I mean, when you look at an institution like European Space Agency, it represents Europe pretty well by convention, and I do think that the gender diversity has improved significantly in the last few years. A long way to go, but it is getting better. But there's lots of other diversities which we're not there yet. And so when you look at it from the outside, you say, well, it's a hopelessly unreformed institution. I'm not looking for kind comments or negative comments. You're just an outsider on what Gaitee and I are doing now.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it comes back to class, like wherever you are in Europe, if you're middle class and above, you're more likely to be white. And a lot of that, I think, goes back to what we were saying about nepotism and role models. So just for anybody out there who's watching, consider me your auntie. If you need someone, like Gaitee was saying as well, you need just a hype man to tell you can do this, like, please contact me. Obviously I'm much more familiar with like British London people, but the offer goes for anyone, and I think that's how we can do it, is just get more people out there. As you say, you need to be a bit more proactive, because people are just going to assume it's not for them. Whereas other people from different demographics are just like applying for stuff they're not qualified for, and then they learn on the job and they do fine and they don't mind the rejection. But it can just be so demoralizing, and your bandwidth is taken much with so much other stuff, that I think that's the reason why perhaps ESA, like anywhere, like wider societal problems, as you go up these chains where it does take a little bit more privilege and nepotism and just understanding the world, already science is really dense and esoteric for people to get their heads around. And I think that, in some ways scientists play into that, as I was saying before, of like, this is really hard, you couldn't do it, I'm so clever. And so you've got that extra layer of that. So if we can make it more open, make it more transparent, and then invite people in, and more importantly, once they're invited in, make it a nice place for them. And all of this will come back to, it's a little bit of a vicious circle. Like, it will become nicer once people from those backgrounds are in there, and they will bring more in. But we need to force it. Sometimes you need to smash the glass ceiling and worry about picking up the pieces later. And I don't have any problem with that.
Yeah.
Incredibly well said. And, I suppose this is an interesting, point to, consider, which is that, for many people, their entry point, their exposure to, the worlds of space exploration and science is actually science fiction, right? It's not necessarily school, it's the television. And isn't it interesting that how many of those genres, they do depict the future as somehow utopian, just that somehow we haven't just, gone out there. We haven't just mastered these technologies, but we've also solved some of our own problems as well, societally and so on. I suppose Star Trek is probably a really good example of that. But oh, fantastic! Well, this is something I'm wondering about. What was your earliest exposure then? Where did the initial spark come from? Because we know about that curiosity, Jacqueline. But was it something like that as well? Where did it initially come from, and what planted that seed for you?
Yeah, I was never one of those kids that was like, I want to be a scientist, like always. I loved Star Trek. Like, I grew up watching Star Trek. Like, the Star Trek Next Generation came out in like late 80s, I guess. And I started watching it from scratch because my dad used to watch the old Star Trek. And so we started watching that. And Geordie LaForge was my favorite character because he was the engineer and he used to fix everything. He was so great. At no point did I be like, I could become an engineer like Geordie LaForge. Like, at no point did it even occur to me. And there was obviously, as you say, there was loads of women in Star Trek. And, sci-fi in general has always been a place where people who don't conventionally get lead roles or have certain body types can do. And it's a lot more diverse. But at no point did I think like I could do one of these jobs, like one of these many jobs that are depicted on Star Trek. I was just like, this is just something I enjoy as a hobby. I always really liked dinosaurs and stuff. So I think I remember in school that there was looking at archaeology, but again, I was just like, this is not a viable career path. I was just like, you just have to go and get a job like in the supermarket, basically in the supermarket. And I remember I got in like Mr. Swinson, my teacher, who I did technical drawing for from Howard. I don't know if he's still around. Like, hello, Mr. Swinson. He was just like, you're really good at technical drawing. You should go and do this this stuff like with a draftsman's office. Like, there was some sort of building works going on around the back of Edmonton, and they were like, you could go there and do your work experience 2 weeks there. And I couldn't go because we didn't have a car. So it would mean I needed to get dropped off there. So I did it at Peacock's shop in Edmonton, in 4th Street in Edmonton. And I worked in a shop. And so everything in my head was just like, you work in a shop, like that's what you do. So when I became a train driver, I kind of grabbed with both hands all of the technical stuff, because you have to do all this kind of stock training to understand your train, because if it breaks down, you're stuck in the tunnel and you have to fix it, and you have to know the mechanics of the train, and you have to know all the signaling systems and how the electricity works in the rails, and it's all quite technical. And I just loved it. But at no point did I think I could become an engineer or a scientist. And so it really took until towards the end of my undergrad that it actually dawned on me that I might actually get a job. Like, all of it was just like, I'm interested in it. And it was just not for me. Like, it was just not for me to have a job in this, regardless of, I'd clearly had an interest in it. I remember clearly watching Geordie LaForge like fix the warp drive in Star Trek, and at no point had I thought that I could do that. But that's what we've got to change.
You became Geordie LaForge on the tube. I mean, if nothing else, come on, this is just what you described.
Yeah, I know, but you don't, it just doesn't seem, it's like a cognitive dissonance there. It doesn't seem that even when you're physically doing it and fixing things and getting, Starship Enterprise running again, it doesn't seem like you can really do it. You're really capable, like Gaitee was saying. Even she'd been told, this job is for you, and clearly was qualified to do it and got the job, but you're still just always second guessing yourself. And that is compounded for people who don't see people like themselves in those jobs, because it's just message after message that this is not for you.
And Gaitee, the science fiction thing, Alex did tell me that Gene Roddenberry would come up. It was pretty inevitable, but is science fiction an issue, a thing for you in the past? I mean, because for all that there's utopian science fiction, there's lots of dystopian. I mean, one of our favorite series at the moment is The Expanse, and I don't know if either of you have seen that, but that portrays It is actually, in casting, it's extremely diverse, but it actually uses the casting to show that the structures which we have on the Earth today will probably continue on Mars, in the belt, and so on. But anyway, your background there, is there, you're nodding as if, oh, don't ask me about science fiction, Mark.
No, I mean, I love science fiction, but I'm really probably more of a classic science fiction person. So I kind of like the utopian angle, where it's really sort of examining the human condition possibly a bit more. So Asimov. Also, I really liked Gibson as well, Neuromancer and that stuff.
I don't think that's particularly utopian, William.
No,
Gibson.
it isn't. But you know, that whole idea of what is human, and where does that boundary finish, and all of that aspect of it really fascinates me. But the more dystopian science fiction, I mean, I've dipped a toe in the water, but honestly, life's too depressing these days.
Yeah.
I stick to stuff.
This is where I unfortunately have to shatter your illusions about Isaac Asimov, who of course is famous.
Oh no, I know.
So I hope you figured that one out by now.
I reread Foundation recently, and I was just like, where did all the women go? Like, seriously, where are the women?
Well, yeah, I mean, not only that, but all of the scandals of him groping women and the rest of it. I did a radio program a year ago where I was asked to talk about, it was the birthday, I think, the 100th anniversary of both Asimov and Bradbury, I think at the same time, or Heinlein, one or the other. And I just completely subverted the radio program. So, well, I'm not particularly interested in them anymore. So let's talk about all the great writers who are writing cool stuff today. Anyway.
But yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And certainly rereading it, you certainly question some of your formative experiences having read the books. You're just like, what the hell did I normalize in my time? But yeah. So these days, I have to say, I do avoid depressing stuff. But I do love science fiction and fantasy as well. So I was a big fan of McCaffrey and dragons and stuff like that. It's good fun, which ended up in science fiction in the later books.
Yeah.
Well, I definitely approve of all those things as well. I mean, I did warn Mark, but I mean, I suppose it's just because I mean, there's so much about Gene Roddenberry's vision specifically that speaks to this ideal, something that we aspire to. I mean, we've talked about this before, Mark, and it does come up from time to time that really the innovations that scientific cooperation represent are often not about technology or the innovations themselves, but just the ability of people to cooperate. And one thing that is definitely clear is the more people you have cooperating, the better the team is. And I suppose that's what we really need to aspire to. That's the real innovation that needs to be promoted. I mean, regardless of the discovery, regardless of the achievements and so on, that's the thing that has to change and has to be accelerated so we really can all get there. And I suppose that's not perhaps a final thought from Gaitee and Jacqueline, I think. And, I suppose what we haven't done is answer all of these questions, but what we have done is frame some incredibly important questions. And it's a conversation that we need to keep having again and again. So a final thought, Gaitee?
I think what this conversation has shown is there's a lot of work to be done, and we need to work out how best to do it without harming, even approaching things with our best intentions. So I think we can learn from other places that have done well, and I very much welcome if anybody would like to get in touch and share resources or have ideas on things that we should be doing. I would like to use this forum to really welcome that, because I'm really trying to collect ideas at the moment. It's my first 6 months at ESA, so it's a good time for me to be coming up with a plan. So do get in touch if you'd like to.
That's great. And Jacqueline?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you so much for hosting this. We're talking a lot about like old white guys and stuff, but it's just thank you very much for like inviting us on here to talk about this. It's really important stuff. And I guess my message would just be to hype up anybody out there who's thinking science is not for me. Like, it is for you. You can do it. You are smart enough. And you're already an expert in something else that you can transfer all those skills over. And if there's anything I can do to help you, then please do reach out to me.
Well, it's us who's thanking you both for joining us, and now we're going to have to impose on you, Mark. It's traditional that you do this, and I'm really sorry, but it's the rules.
It's the rules, exactly, the rules. Well, and let me just say thanks as well. I mean, look, there's the danger that this would just be one of those things. We talk about it and then we walk away and we tick a box and say we've talked about it. This is absolutely not one of those discussions. I mean, and Alex knows that I'm constantly banging on this in the context of space rocks. Because, to be honest, you know, the one thing we haven't mentioned today at all is that actually, at least for me, this is not about bringing more people into science, in a sense, because that's sort of a one-way thing. It's also about trying to reopen the doors the other way. And as you said earlier on, Jacqueline, about making scientists real people who do real things in your life, so that when it comes to saying, am I going to get vaccinated or not? Well, if your neighbour's a scientist who's had it and comes from the same background as you, you're not going to say, oh, it's the elite who are trying to control me with 5G, or climate change, right? Oh, that's just for people, you know, poncing around. I've got to make a living here. I can't sell my old petrol car and just go and buy a £50,000 electric car. It doesn't work that way, because we've got beyond, you know, frankly, it's all very well exploring the universe. We've got much bigger problems here, and how can we use how we do solve problems out there to maybe identify and some of the challenges we have here and use that as a lever. Yeah, but so we would definitely want to continue the dialogue with both of you and with anybody else who's interested, of course, because it's important that we carry this on. It's a fundamental aspect of what Space Rocks is about. But the more trivial thing is indeed, as Alex said, you've already done half of it, Jacqueline. But so we need to do the space. This is Live Long and Prosper, and the rocks. And so thank you both very much enormously for coming on this evening, and we'll talk to you both again very soon.
Very good.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you so much. Take care.
You too.
Bye-bye now.
Bye.
Very good then. Well, Mark, what a fantastic conversation, and one that I would really love to continue as well. What brilliant guests, and just so many important concepts, explored, and well, we just need to keep going.
Yeah, look, you know, as I said just a second ago, there's a real danger that you do these things and you say, you know, box ticked. Absolutely not. The box will remain open and unticked for as long as I'm around and as you are around and other generations to come, unfortunately. I mean, this is a process that needs to be engaged with, but I think it's incredibly important as a mark of sort of the integrity of what we're doing, that we do better. We've done okay, but we need to do so much more in Space Rocks. That's one small piece of what the European Space Agency does and of many of the endeavours in science. So absolutely, it's the beginning of a much longer conversation, and we're keen to carry on. And we will do that here in Uplink, but we'll carry it on outside as well. Very important.
Indeed, and we'll have to have them back again and continue, not just on this, but on their fields of research as well.
Well, that's of course, yes. Let's be honest, right? I mean, at some point, Gaitee said I was invited to come and talk about diversity at a conference, and here we are doing it. They're both great scientists, and we will definitely bring them both back in to talk about what they do in that regard. I feel a little chastened, but we always have the opportunity to invite them back, and we will.
Absolutely, absolutely. So speaking of future guests, if you're watching tonight, we've been putting into chat. Do subscribe to our newsletter. Go to spacerocksofficial.com in order to do that. We will be back next week, Mark, with two very different guests, no doubt exploring equally stimulating topics.
Indeed. So space and rocks. So the space side we've talked about, and access and inclusivity and diversity to the space business. But the rock side, the music side, of course. Last week we had Vangelis, and we're switching back to music again next week, but with another spacey tinge. And the two guests next week, firstly will be Laura Kidd, who's known in the music sphere by her nom de plume, pen friend. And previously She Makes War, and she just has a new album coming out soon, which is interesting, not if only, but many interesting things. I've heard a copy of it. It's fantastic music, but there are a few songs on there which actually involve sound samples from ESTEC, the place where I work up the road, of Mars rovers and engineering and so on being built into the music. And that takes us to the other guest, who, in a sense, has not used space sounds from the ground, but has used found footage and found sounds. And that's Jay Wilgoose Esquire, who is one of the three members of Public Service Broadcasting, famous for their album Race for Space a few years ago. Music and film about the space race in the 1960s from both the Soviet and the American side. And they're both incredibly passionate people about music, but also about science and technology. And really looking forward to that discussion with Laura and Jay Wilgoose Esquire next week.
Indeed. And to answer someone in the chat, yes, PSB, Public Service Broadcasting. I'm really looking forward to having both Laura. And I think that we're going to have a lot to talk about, Mark. So a delight to see you as ever. Thank you to everybody who joined tonight. Sorry I couldn't get to every question, but we welcome more thoughts. So do just get in touch with us on social media. And Mark, as ever, an absolute pleasure to see you.
Yeah, likewise, Alex. See you all next week.
Very good. Be well.
Bye for now.
Yeah.